Psychology can just be considered the study of the human brain and how it works. And the brain is part of your nervous system, which is a network of billions of cells in your brain and your body that are responsible for all things that you think and feel and do. And you can break that nervous system down into two parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So central nervous system, that's your brain and spinal cord. Peripheral is everything else, basically. Now, when we call it the nervous system, what we're referring to is the fact that it's full of nerves. A nerve is just like a thick bundle, a large bundle of axons from neurons. In the last video we talked about neurons and axons and stuff like that, so just imagine like a bunch, like a whole bunch of those axons all bundled together into this big thick wire. And the point of these like bundles of wires, bundles of axons, is to convey information from the body to the brain and vice versa. So the most interesting part of the nervous system, in psychology of course, would be the central nervous system. This is like your processing center. Remember, this is your brain and spinal cord. The point of the central nervous system is to collect information through those nerves, collect information from your body, send it to the brain so that the brain can process it, and then the brain will send back out through a different set of nerves, motor commands. Now there's a few really cool things about the brain that I want to mention before we really get into detail. I also have a couple of links to some videos you should check out, especially if you've never seen like a real brain. Like if you've seen brains in movies and stuff like that, generally that's not a very accurate depiction of what they look like. So please check out the links in the description. But the first thing I want to mention about your brain is that it is incredibly fragile. Your brain is totally squishy. It's got basically the consistency of Jell-O. So we need to try to protect your brain as best as we can. The first layer of protection would be, of course, your skin and your skull, which are helping to protect your brain. But just underneath that skull, you have more layers of protection. So you have what are called the meninges. The meninges are basically like these tissue layers. It's basically like imagine a water balloon. Like the brain is like floating inside this kind of water balloon. So this water that I'm referring to, we call it a cerebral spinal fluid. And the cerebral spinal fluid, the purpose of that is basically to cushion the brain. Whenever you get hit in the head, if your brain was sitting up right against the skull, it would just get crushed. But since you have this cerebral spinal fluid, it allows the brain to kind of like slosh around a little bit. And this is why you might get a headache if you spin around really, really fast and then stop. Your brain might still be moving a little bit. So the cerebral spinal fluid does help to cushion the brain. Now, whenever we talk about the brain, we use a few important terms, anatomical direction kind of terms. So just as a general idea, here's how it works. Dorsal means upward, towards the top of your head. Ventral means down to the bottom of your head. Posterior means towards the back, and interior means towards the forward. Now, your brain is broken down into 5 basic sections. Those sections would be the telencephalon, which consists of the big noodly part and something at the very center of your brain that's called the limbic system. Then you have the diencephalon, which is just below that, followed by the mesencephalon, the metencephalon, which consists of a part of your brainstem and your cerebellum, which is that little smaller looking kind of brain structure in the back. And then at the very base of your brain would be the myelencephalon. So the telencephalon, like I said, that consists mostly of your big noodly, what's called the cerebral cortex. That's the outermost layer of your brain. It's where you're going to find 70% of the neurons in your central nervous system. And it's that cerebral cortex that's broken up into 4 separate lobes. I'll talk about the lobes in a little bit. And it's also split into 2 hemispheres. So you have like a left cerebral cortex and a right cerebral cortex. Now the interesting thing about the cerebral cortex is what gives us our superior intelligence, to put it simply. When you compare the different cerebral cortexes of different animals, what you'll generally find is that the animals that we consider to be the most intelligent generally have the most impressive looking cerebral cortexes for their size, of course. So for humans, our cerebral cortex is very big in proportion to the rest of our body. You'll see similarly impressive looking cerebral cortexes in animals like dolphins or many primates. Even dogs have pretty good looking cerebral cortexes. But if we compare them to other animals, like cats for example, we see that cats just aren't as noodly. They aren't as large. So we can reasonably assume that means the cat isn't, plotting against you. It's probably not really thinking about anything besides food and sleep. So that second part of the telencephalon that I mentioned was the limbic system. The limbic system is at the very center of your brain, and this is a collection of neural structures that are closely linked to things like emotional processing, motivation, stuff like that. Like you actually have a part in your limbic system, a little structure in your limbic system called the amygdala, and that seems to be like your fear center. Like people who have had their amygdala damaged or destroyed simply feel no fear anymore. While that might sound nice, in reality it's extremely hazardous, because if you never feel any fear, then you're not going to avoid dangerous situations where you could be seriously injured. Another function of the limbic system is to process memories. So there's a structure called the hippocampus that's also located here that is required for creating new memories. Next you have the diencephalon, which consists of structures like the thalamus and the hypothalamus. This is basically like, it does some emotional processing, but these structures basically do like sensory information, transmission. Like you can kind of think as the diencephalon is basically like a sensory relay center, where it will collect that incoming sensory information and send it to different parts of the brain for processing. Next there's the mesencephalon. You could also call it the midbrain. It's just below that diencephalon. And this has a few important structures for, just transmitting different kinds of information, but we don't really need to go into detail about it right now. Just below that, there's the metencephalon. And like I said, it consists of part of the brainstem. That part is called the pons. And also that little smaller brain looking thing in the back called cerebellum. Now, the pons we know is important for moderating your sleep behavior. Like there's important structures here that will influence, when you sleep and how long you sleep, and also waking up from sleep. Like if you have damage in this area, you might have a severe sleep disorder, or maybe you'll go into a coma that you'll never wake up from again. So this is a very important structure in the brain. The cerebellum, that does a different purpose. It seems to be mostly for like motor stuff. So we know it plays important roles in things like motor learning, balance, timing, accuracy. Like if you have damage in your cerebellum, you'll have trouble making specific kinds of motor movements. We also think it might play roles in things like attention and language and fear, stuff like that. But it definitely is it seems to mostly be about motor control. Then the very last one would be the myelencephalon, and that is at the very base of your brainstem. The most important structure here would definitely be the medulla, which controls your vital life functions like heart rate, swallowing, and breathing. Like if you have damage at this base of your brain, if you have damage in your myelencephalon, you might just immediately die. Like you need this part of your brain. You need this medulla just in order to survive for the next few seconds. It's that important. So the good news is it is also one of the most well-protected parts of your brain. Like it's got a lot of nice thick skull all around it. Other structures, that are part of this brainstem and cerebral cortex would include things like the endocrine system. The endocrine system is just a bunch of different kinds of glands that will pour chemicals that we call hormones directly into your blood or lymph system. Now, there's a few different kinds of glands, but the ones I wanted to talk about are the pituitary gland, the pineal gland, the thyroid, and the adrenal glands. So the pituitary gland is what's important for regulating your growth. It releases what's called the growth hormone. It's also important for things like hanging out with your friends and having positive social interactions. It releases another hormone called oxytocin, which will be released whenever you're, having a good social bonding experience. So and as we'll talk about in a later video, oxytocin is very important for just handling stress in our lives. So the general idea is, if you're feeling really stressed out, go hang out with your friends for a while and it'll make you feel better. Then you have the pineal gland, which is important for regulating your body rhythm and your sleep cycles. That releases a hormone called melatonin that will respond to daily variations in light levels. I know melatonin supplements are kind of popular nowadays. Like whenever I go to the store, I see melatonin on sale. We've done research on taking melatonin supplements to help with sleep problems, and it simply doesn't work. If you are buying these things, don't. If it has any effectiveness, that is just pure placebo effects. In other words, it's not real. Then you have the thyroid gland, which is important for your metabolism. If you have a problem with your thyroid, like if your thyroid is too active, if you have a condition called hyperthyroidism, then that means you are generally tense, excitable, nervous, perhaps very thin. On the other hand, if you have an underactive thyroid, if you have hypothyroidism, now you're going to be a bit slower, a bit more depressed, perhaps a bit sleepier, just less active in general. Like whenever I think of hypothyroidism, the first person I think of is Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. Like if you're familiar with that character, Eeyore is always just kind of down. He's always kind of pessimistic, and he's always really slow to react. But it's not like he's seriously depressed. It's just he's always low. So that's what hypothyroidism looks like. Then you have the adrenal glands, which are much lower in your body. It's located just on top of your kidneys. Your adrenal glands are important for basically like fight or flight kind of responses. So it's about bodily arousal, adjustment to stress. It's also important for sexual functioning. And your adrenal glands can release a couple different kinds of hormones. It can release epinephrine, which is associated with flight response. So epinephrine or adrenaline, that's what makes you feel fear and make you want to get out of that situation. But it could also release a hormone called norepinephrine or noradrenaline, which is the hormone that will be pumping through your system if you're ready to start a fight. So fear and anger are moderated by these two separate kinds of hormones. But let's get back to the cerebral cortex and talk about those lobes I mentioned earlier. You have the frontal lobe, which is, the most frontal part. It's the part that's most anterior on your brain. Then you have the parietal lobe, which is towards the top near the back. The occipital lobe, which is at the very back part of your brain. And then the temporal lobes, which are on the sides. And the frontal lobe we know is important for your higher level thinking skills, and also it's really important for motor control. So you have areas of your frontal lobe that are incredibly important, just not only being able to engage in motor commands, but also just to understand what other people's motor commands mean. Like you actually have a strip at the most, posterior part of your frontal lobe called the primary motor cortex, and basically every voluntary muscle movement you make originates there. Like I said, the frontal lobe is also responsible for like high-level thinking skills. Like whenever you think about yourself, or when you think about your future or abstract concepts, whenever you're just controlling your emotions and things like that, stuff we generally associate with being mature and intellectual, that kind of stuff is processed in the most frontal part of your brain. We call it the prefrontal cortex. Now, just as a side note, your prefrontal cortex does not finish developing until your early 20s. So the consequence of this would be that younger people who aren't young adults, younger people simply lack the ability. They don't have the tools that are required in order to just understand themselves, understand other people, just think at this higher level that we take for granted as adults. Now, there is a really interesting part of your frontal lobe that's located very close to that primary motor cortex called Broca's area. Now, Broca's area is an area discovered by a guy named Broca. Broca's area is important for language skills. So if you have damage to Broca's area, then that means you won't be able to communicate effectively. Like any speech you're able to produce will be broken and really hard to understand. Like it'll basically be speech that has no grammar, no mechanics at all. It's just a string of nouns and verbs, basically. So you might be able to figure out what a person's trying to say if they have damage to Broca's area, but it's not going to be easy. And it's not going to sound like they know how to talk. Parietal lobe, that's the part that's towards the top near the back. We know that that's mostly about motion and spatial processing. It also contains an area that's at the most anterior part of the parietal lobe, right next to that frontal lobe. There's a little strip of neurons that we call the primary somatosensory cortex, and that's the primary processing area for all of your touch sensations. So whenever somebody touches your skin, or if you feel some pain or some heat or pressure, like all that stuff is initially just sent to that little strip at the very anterior part of your parietal lobe. Now, your occipital lobe, the most posterior part of your brain, at the back of your cerebral cortex, contains what's called the primary visual area. And that's pretty much all the occipital lobe is for. The occipital lobe processes visual information. So obviously, if you get damage to your occipital lobe, you're going to have trouble seeing things, or at least making sense of the things you see. And depending on where in this occipital lobe the damage occurs, you'll have more severe visual deficits. Like if you have damage at the most back part, at the very, very back of your occipital lobe, then you'll probably be blind. But if you have damage higher up, more towards the front of your brain, then you might simply lose the ability to perceive differences between people's faces. Like you might have what's called facial agnosia, where you simply cannot tell people apart based on their face. Now there's nothing, you can see their face, you can see it clearly, but it's just your brain doesn't have the tools required to make sense of that information. On the sides, just above your ears, that's the temporal lobe. And the primary purpose of the temporal lobe seems to be processing auditory information. So you have your primary auditory area in that temporal lobe. And this is also really important for speech. Like there is a part of your temporal lobe that we call Wernicke's area, because it was discovered by a guy by the name of Wernicke. And if you have damage to this part of your temporal lobe, then you will still be able to speak fluently. Like there's no motor deficits like that. So you can speak as fluently as I am. But the words themselves seem to have no real meaning. It's kind of like word salad. Like if you were just walking past somebody who has Wernicke's aphasia, you probably wouldn't notice that what they're saying is gibberish. It's garbage. It makes no sense. And the interesting thing about Wernicke's aphasia is because these people's speech make no sense, it's kind of hard to tell if they even understand themselves. Because if you try to ask them, do you understand that what you're saying is gibberish? their response is going to be gibberish. As I mentioned earlier in the video, your cerebral cortex is split into two parts. Like you basically have two separate cerebral cortexes in your brain. We call those the two cerebral hemispheres. And there are some interesting differences between them. Like we know just in general, language skills are typically on the left side of your brain. They're on the left hemisphere. Whereas more visual kinds of skills, more creative skills, like music and art and emotion and stuff like that, they tend to be more so on the right side of your cerebral cortex. Another thing that we see very clearly is that the left cerebral cortex is responsible for perception, sensation and perception and motor control of the right side of the body, whereas the right cerebral cortex, the right hemisphere, is responsible for the left side. So if you, for example, if you were to remove your left cerebral cortex, your entire right side of your body would be paralyzed and insensitive. Like you wouldn't be able to feel anything, you wouldn't be able to see anything that's going into the right side of your body. And a common question students have is, why is it like crisscross like this? Like why is that the left hemisphere does the right side of the body? My answer to you is, I didn't design the brain. If I designed the brain, it would make a little bit more sense. It seems like a poor design choice, in my opinion. But just in general, like I kind of get angry when I talk about these lateral differences, with these differences between the two hemispheres, because it's really generally overblown. Like in popular psychology and a lot of these pseudopsychologies that are out there, they tend to really, really magnify the differences between the two hemispheres. There really isn't much difference at all. Like if you've ever heard the whole idea that some people are left-brained and some people are right-brained, that is a gross exaggeration of what the research actually shows. In reality, the two hemispheres are basically the same. It's just one of them tends to do language a little bit more, and the other one tends to do like non-language skills a little bit more. But besides that, there's really not much of a difference. So it's really, really inaccurate to say, you're a left-brained person, you hate artistic stuff. That's gibberish, it's garbage. Now, the primary connection between these two hemispheres, because it wouldn't be a good thing to have two completely separate brains, they're actually connected in many ways, but the primary connection is called the corpus callosum. It's this big, thick bundle of fibers that connect the two cerebral hemispheres, and it's located in the very center of your brain. So this just allows those two hemispheres to communicate with each other. It allows them to share information. So if somebody touches you on the left side of your body, that information will go to the right hemisphere and then transfer over to the left through this corpus callosum. Unless your corpus callosum has been destroyed. Like some people who have certain disorders like epilepsy, they might undergo surgery to have that corpus callosum severed. That way, that seizure that starts on one hemisphere won't then travel over to the other one and cause a more severe disorder. Like it's much preferred to just keep that seizure only on one side of the brain. But the unfortunate consequence of severing the corpus callosum is now you quite literally do have two completely separate brains in your body. So the right hemisphere is not able to share the information with the left and vice versa. So there's a lot of interesting consequences that people will have here, but just imagine like if you had this problem, if you were to like close one of your eyes and see something that is transmitted to your left brain, well, your right brain is literally in the dark. Your right brain has no idea what that thing is, and because your right brain controls the left side of your body, you wouldn't be able to meaningfully like interact with it. Like you would be reaching in the dark, quite literally. Now, besides the brain, the other part of your central nervous system would be the spinal cord. You could think of the spinal cord as just like a super highway of neural communication. It contains all those nerves that are going to and coming from the brain. And it's nice and thick bone to protect those spinal nerves. So there's actually 31 pairs of nerves that carry that sensory and motor information from the brain to the rest of the body. And like I'm sure you're aware that depending on, like if you were to have your spinal cord broken, depending on where it's broken, you'll have no ability to move or sense anything from that point below. Now, the peripheral nervous system, everything else that's not brain and spinal cord, the primary purpose of this seems to be to collect sensory information and transmit it to the central nervous system, and then to receive motor commands from the central nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system is broken into two branches. Like you have the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So the somatic, you can think of it as the part you have control over. So the somatic nervous system is responsible for nearly all of your voluntary muscle movements, as well as sensory processing. So the somatic nervous system is what allows you to move your muscles. So it's comprised of neurons that connect to your sensory organs and skeletal muscles. But the autonomic nervous system is quite different. The autonomic nervous system, you might as well call it the automatic nervous system, because you generally don't have any real control over this part. So this is the part of your peripheral nervous system that controls things like breathing rate, salivation rate, heart rate, pupil dilation, digestion of food in your intestines and your stomach, sweat, like how much you sweat, and things like that. Of course, some of these things you can exert temporary control over, but the default setting is certainly automatic. Like I don't need to think about breathing, I just breathe.